The early morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of Sarah Matthews' neatly organized apartment, casting warm stripes across her carefully selected outfit, laid out on the bed. A light blue blouse, dark navy slacks, and sensible shoes. Professional, but approachable. Perfect for a teaching assistant on her first day, Sarah stood before her bathroom mirror, practicing her introduction for the 5th time that morning. "Hello, I'm Sarah Matthews, your new teaching assistant. I'm so excited to work with all of you." Her voice trembled slightly, a mixture of nervousness and unbridled excitement, making her hands shake as she carefully applied a light touch of makeup. At 32 years old, Sarah had faced countless people telling her what she couldn't do. The words echoed through her memory as she prepared. Too difficult, not realistic, special needs, limitations. But today was different. Today those voices would finally be silenced by her achievement. On the refrigerator, held by a colorful magnet, hung her teaching assistant certification, the result of 3 years of dedicated study, twice the time it took most students. Next to it was a photo of her graduation day, her parents standing proudly beside her, tears in their eyes. They had always believed, even when few others did. "Today is your day, Sarah," she whispered to her reflection, adjusting the butterfly pin on her blouse, a gift from her mother. "You've earned this." The kitchen timer chimed, and Sarah hurried to prepare her lunch. Everything had been planned with precision. The night before, she had packed her teaching supplies, colorful markers, stickers for good work, a small puzzle for children who finished their assignments early. Details she had learned were important during her practicum. As she packed her lunch, Sarah's mind wandered to the journey that had brought her here, the special education classes where teachers first noticed her gift for helping others, the career counselor who suggested she consider a different path, something less demanding, the community college advisor who reluctantly accepted her into the teaching assistant program after her 3rd application. Her certification exam, which she'd passed with higher scores than many neurotypical students, proved what Sarah had always known. Her Down syndrome might make some things challenging, but it also gave her unique strengths, patience, empathy, and a perspective that could reach children in ways others couldn't. Sarah checked her watch, 7:15 a.m. Dead the butterflies in. Her stomach intensified. Westfield Elementary was a 20-minute bus ride away, and she had planned to arrive early to familiarize herself with the building before meeting the staff. She took one final look around her apartment, her eyes lingering on the vision board. That dominated one wall. Magazine cutouts of classrooms, inspirational quotes, and in the center the words, "Ms. Sarah, Teaching Assistant," in her own careful handwriting. 6 years of dreaming, now becoming reality. The bus arrived exactly on schedule. Sarah held her documentation folder tightly against her chest as she found a seat. Inside were copies of her certification, her employment contract, and a letter of recommendation from her practicum supervisor describing her as exceptionally dedicated and a natural with children who struggle. As the bus rolled through the quiet morning streets, Sarah rehearsed potential scenarios in her mind. She had prepared for questions about her disability, practiced explanations of her accommodations, minimal as they were, and readied responses to any concerns. Experience had taught her to anticipate skepticism. Her phone buzzed with encouraging text messages from her parents and her support group. "You'll be amazing. The kids will love you. So proud of you." Sarah smiled, drawing strength from their confidence in her. The elementary school came into view, its brick facade and colorful playground visible from the bus window. Sarah's heart raced as she pulled the stop request cord. This was it, the moment she had worked toward through years of determination. As she stepped off the bus, Sarah adjusted her blouse, checked that her hair was still neatly secured in its clip, and took a deep breath. The school grounds were quiet, with only a few early arriving teachers entering the building. Perfect timing. Walking toward the entrance, Sarah rehearsed Principal Hargrove's name in her mind. They had spoken briefly during her interview, and while the principal had seemed reserved, Sarah had attributed it to professionalism rather than doubt. The school's mission statement was displayed prominently beside the entrance. Nurturing diverse learners in an inclusive environment. Sarah smiled at those words. They were why she had applied to Westfield specifically, a school that claimed to value the very diversity she represented. At the front desk, Sarah introduced herself to the secretary, presenting her folder of documentation. "Good morning. I'm Sarah Matthews, the new teaching assistant. Today is my first day." Her voice was clear and confident, just as she had practiced. The secretary looked up, momentary surprise flickering across her face before she composed herself. "Oh, right. Principal Hargrove mentioned you'd be starting today." She took the folder hesitantly. "You can wait in the staff lounge. The morning. Meeting starts in 20 minutes. As Sarah walked toward the staff lounge, her mind filled with visions of the day ahead. The children she would help, the lessons she would support, the difference she would make. After all the barriers, all the doubts, all the extra hurdles she had cleared to reach this moment, Sarah was finally where she belonged. In the empty staff lounge, Sarah chose a seat at the table, placed her teaching supplies neatly beside her, and waited for her new colleagues. Despite the slight knot of anxiety in her stomach, her heart swelled with pride and purpose. Today was just the beginning. Sarah Matthews, a woman with Down syndrome who had defied every limitation others had tried to impose, was about to prove what she had always known, that she belonged in a classroom, helping children learn, grow, and understand that differences were not deficits, but strengths. Little did she know that this day would test her in ways she hadn't anticipated, that her dream would face its greatest challenge yet, and that an unexpected ally would emerge when she needed one most. But for now, in this quiet moment before it all began, Sarah simply smiled, ready to embrace her dream at last. The staff lounge gradually filled with teachers and administrators, their morning conversations creating a buzz of activity around Sarah. She sat, quietly, observing as they greeted each other with familiar ease, sharing weekend stories, discussing lesson plans, and refilling coffee cups. A few curious glances were cast in her direction, but no one approached her directly. Sarah maintained her smile, though her grip on her folder tightened slightly. She had anticipated this awkward first moment. Being the new person was always challenging, and being visibly different added another layer of complexity. When a young woman with curly hair and bright green glasses entered, she immediately noticed Sarah and approached with a warm smile. "You must be Sarah Matthews. I'm Lisa Chen, third-grade teacher. We've been told you'd be joining us today." She extended her hand, which Sarah gratefully shook. "Yes, that's me." "I'm so excited to be here," Sarah replied, her rehearsed introduction flowing naturally now that someone had broken the ice. Ms. Chen sat beside her. "Have you been shown around yet? The school can be a bit of a maze initially." Before Sarah could respond, a tall, impeccably dressed woman entered the lounge. The room immediately quieted as Principal Diana Hargrove surveyed the assembled staff, her gaze eventually landing on Sarah. Unlike Ms. Chen's warm welcome, the principal's expression remained neutral, professionally distant. "Good morning, everyone," Principal Hargrove announced. "Let's begin our staff meeting before the students arrive." She gestured toward a whiteboard where the day's announcements were listed. "First, as some of you know, we have a new teaching assistant joining us today. Sarah Matthews will be assisting in classrooms as needed." Sarah stood, ready to give her prepared introduction, but Principal Hargrove continued without pause, moving on to discuss upcoming standardized testing procedures. Sarah slowly sat back down, her unspoken words caught in her throat. Ms. Chen gave her a sympathetic glance. After reviewing the announcements, Principal Hargrove closed her binder decisively. "Ms. Matthews will be assigned to Ms. Chen's classroom. Initially. Ms. Chen, please ensure she's oriented to our procedures. Everyone else have a productive day." As the meeting dispersed, the administrative assistant, Jake Peterson, approached with a visitor badge. "You'll need to wear this until your permanent ID arrives," he explained, his tone professionally detached. "HR needs additional documentation from you as well. Come by the office during lunch." "Additional documentation?" Sarah questioned, confusion evident in her voice. "I submitted everything during my interview." Jake shrugged. Just following instructions. There are apparently some specialized forms required in your case." He walked away before Sarah could inquire further. Ms. Chen, who had overheard the exchange, touched Sarah's arm gently. "Don't worry about Jake. He's inefficient with everyone. Come on, I'll show you around before the students arrive." As they toured the school, Sarah noticed the varying reactions from staff they encountered. Some offered polite smiles, others displayed poorly disguised surprise, and a few exchanged whispers after they passed. Sarah had experienced these reactions throughout her life and had developed strategies to focus on her purpose rather than others' perceptions. "The kids will be arriving in about 20 minutes, Ms. Chen explained as they entered her colorful classroom. "I have 27 students this year, including 3 with learning accommodations. I'm really looking forward to having your help." For the first time that morning, Sarah felt fully welcomed. "Thank you for the opportunity," she replied sincerely. "I specialized in differentiated learning techniques during my certification program. I'd love to share some strategies I've found effective." Ms. Chen smiled warmly. "That would be fantastic. We can discuss them during planning period." She handed Sarah a class roster and seating chart. "This should help you learn names quickly." As Sarah reviewed the materials, a student peeked into for the classroom, a small girl with tight braids and a backpack almost as big as she was. "Ms. Chen!" the girl exclaimed, running to hug her teacher. She stopped when she noticed Sarah, curiosity brightening her eyes. "Zoe, you're early today," Ms. Chen greeted her. "I'd like you to meet Ms. Matthews, our new teaching assistant." Sarah knelt to reach Zoe's eye level. "It's very nice to meet you, Zoe. I love your butterfly clips." Zoe beamed. "Thanks. My mom got them special for picture day tomorrow." She studied Sarah's face with the unfiltered curiosity of childhood. "You look different, like my cousin Tommy." Before Sarah could respond, Ms. Chen interjected gently. "Remember what we discussed about everyone being unique, Zoe." "It's okay," Sarah assured Ms. Chen before turning back to Zoe. "You're right, Zoe. I have something called Down syndrome, which makes me look a little different. Just like your butterfly clips make you unique." Zoe considered this, then nodded seriously. "Tommy says his extra chromosome makes him super special. Do you have an extra chromosome too?" Sarah smiled, impressed by the child's knowledge. "I do, that's exactly right." "Cool," Zoe declared, then proceeded to unpack her supplies as if the matter were completely resolved. More students began trickling in, each with their own reaction to the new teaching assistant. Most were straightforwardly curious or accepting, approaching Sarah with questions or showing her their favorite books and drawings. Their unpremeditated acceptance stood in stark contrast to the guarded reception from many of the adults. As the morning progressed, Sarah assisted with reading groups, helped distribute materials, and worked one-on-one with students who needed additional support. She felt in her element, confirming what she had always known: this was where she belonged. During a brief moment when the students were engaged in independent work, Principal Hargrove appeared in the doorway, observing the classroom dynamics with an evaluative eye. Sarah noticed her presence and continued helping a struggling student sound out a difficult word, demonstrating her teaching technique. Principal Hargrove made a few notes on her clipboard before catching Ms. Chen's attention and motioning her into the hallway. Though Sarah couldn't hear their conversation, she noticed Ms. Chen's expression gradually shifting from professional politeness to barely concealed frustration. When Ms. Chen returned, she was noticeably tense. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked. "Quietly?" "Principal Hargrove has some concerns," Ms. Chen replied, keeping her voice low. "But don't worry about it. Your work with Eli just now was exactly what he needed." As the morning continued, Sarah became increasingly aware of being under scrutiny. Whenever she circulated through the administration area, conversations paused. During recess duty, other teachers kept a noticeable distance, their discomfort poorly disguised. By lunchtime, the pattern was clear. While the children responded to Sarah with natural acceptance, many of the adults had already formed judgments about her capabilities based solely on her appearance. As Sarah prepared to visit the office for the additional documentation Jake had mentioned, she mentally rehearsed the words her mother had always told her: "Your value isn't determined by those who don't see your worth." With renewed determination, she straightened her butterfly pin and headed toward the administrative offices, unaware that the greatest challenge to her dream was still to come. The administrative office bustled with activity as Sarah approached. Secretaries answered phones, staff members collected mail from cubbies, and a copy machine hummed continuously in the corner. Jake Peterson glanced up from his computer, his expression shifting from surprise to remembrance. Right, the additional forms. He rifled through a drawer before producing a packet noticeably thicker than standard employment paperwork. Principal Hargrove wants these completed before the end of the day. Sarah accepted the packet, scanning the first page with growing confusion. Supervised employment authorization, guardian contact information. She flipped through the pages. These forms are for employees requiring legal guardianship. Jake shrugged noncommittally. I just distribute what I'm given. I don't have a legal guardian, Sarah stated firmly. I live independently and manage my own affairs. My certification paperwork confirms this. She kept her voice level, despite the familiar frustration rising within her. Jake looked uncomfortable. You'll need to discuss that with Principal Hargrove. As Sarah turned to leave, she nearly collided with a woman wearing large sunglasses and a modest scarf wrapped around her hair. There was something vaguely familiar about her refined features, but Sarah, preoccupied with the inappropriate forms, simply apologized and continued on her way. The woman, unrecognized by anyone in the busy office, was Meryl Streep, quietly, observing school operations for her upcoming role. She watched Sarah's retreating figure with curious interest before continuing her discreet tour with the district arts coordinator, who believed she was simply a potential donor wishing to remain anonymous. Back in Ms. Chen's classroom, lunch preparations were underway. Everything okay? Ms. Chen asked, noticing Sarah's troubled expression. They gave me guardianship forms, Sarah replied quietly, mindful of nearby students. I've encountered this before. People assume I'm not legally independent. Ms. Chen frowned. That's completely inappropriate. Do you want me to say something? Sarah shook her head. I'll handle it. I've had plenty of practice. As the class lined up for lunch, Sarah noticed she hadn't received a staff email with the cafeteria procedures Ms. Chen had mentioned earlier. When she checked with another teaching assistant, the woman responded with obvious discomfort. Oh, I thought someone else would have shown you. In the cafeteria, Sarah helped students open milk cartons and navigate the lunch line. She had expected to join the teacher's table, but found no space saved for her. Ms. Chen, detained by a parent phone call, wasn't present to ease the awkward situation. You can sit with us, Ms. Matthews, called Zoe, patting the bench beside her. Though unconventional, Sarah gratefully accepted the children's invitation, rather than stand uncertainly among staff who seemed determined to overlook her presence. Do you like dinosaurs? Asked a boy named Marcus, showing her his lunchbox. I do, Sarah responded enthusiastically. Did you know scientists recently discovered a dinosaur with feathers like a modern bird? The children's questions flowed naturally, their acceptance complete and uncomplicated. Sarah felt herself relaxing for the first time that day. Here, at least, her difference wasn't a barrier but sometimes even an advantage. Her speech patterns, slightly slower and more deliberate than other adults, matched the children's conversational pace perfectly. From across the cafeteria, Meryl, Streep observed the interaction while pretending to review school lunch nutrition guidelines. Her experienced eye recognized something special in Sarah's natural rapport with the students, a quality many trained actors struggled to achieve with child performers. After lunch, Sarah encountered another setback. Despite Ms. Chen's request for her assistance with the afternoon reading groups, Sarah discovered the materials hadn't been duplicated for her. I'm sorry, said the curriculum coordinator with unconvincing regret. We usually don't provide separate copies for temporary assistance. I'm not temporary, Sarah clarified. I've been hired as permanent staff. The coordinator's eyebrows raised slightly. Oh, I was under the impression. Never mind, I'll see what I can do for next time. Sarah improvised with her own notes as Ms. Chen divided the class into reading groups. Despite the missing materials, she effectively guided her assigned students through their reading exercises, having memorized the key questions during her morning observation. When afternoon recess arrived Ms. Chen received an urgent call to the office. "I hate to ask this on your first day," she said apologetically, "but could you supervise the classroom for a few minutes? They're just doing quiet drawing activities." "Of course," Sarah replied, confident in her ability to manage the task. The children worked contentedly under Sarah's supervision. She circulated among them, offering encouragement and answering questions. When one student struggled with frustration over his drawing, Sarah knelt beside him and gently guided him through. The challenge, drawing on techniques from her certification training. Outside the classroom door, Meryl Streep paused during her tour, observing the natural teaching moment through the window. She noted Sarah's skilled response to the child's frustration and the respectful way the students interacted with her. When Ms. Chen returned, her expression was tense. "Staff meeting after school," she muttered. Apparently, there are concerns about classroom support assignments. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of small challenges. Sarah discovered her security badge wouldn't open the staff resource room. A scheduled team planning session was moved without her being notified. The teacher's assistant group chat. Messages mentioned important updates she'd never received. None of these obstacles was insurmountable, but their accumulation created a clear pattern. While never explicitly stated, the message was unmistakable. She was being systematically excluded. As the final bell rang and students gathered their belongings, Sarah maintained her encouraging smile, helping with backpacks and forgotten lunchboxes. Despite the day's challenges, the children's honest appreciation was undeniable. "See you tomorrow, Ms. Matthews," several called as they departed, their simple acceptance a balm to the day's accumulated frustrations. Sarah gathered her things for the staff meeting, mentally preparing for what might await her. Ms. Chen touched her arm supportively. "Ready?" With a determined nod, Sarah squared her shoulders. "Ready?" Neither woman noticed Meryl Streep lingering outside the classroom, watching thoughtfully as they headed toward the meeting that would set tomorrow's pivotal events in motion. The staff meeting had been worse than Sarah anticipated. Though never directly addressed, she was the clear subject of Principal Hargrove's pointed remarks about maintaining appropriate professional standards and ensuring qualified supervision in all classrooms. The implied message was unmistakable. Many staff members considered her presence an experiment likely to fail. That night, Sarah called her parents for encouragement, then reviewed her teaching materials with renewed determination. She would prove herself through actions, not arguments. The next morning arrived with unexpected challenges. Ms. Chen met Sarah at the classroom door, her expression apologetic. "I've been called to an emergency curriculum meeting. They specifically said teaching assistants weren't needed." Her emphasis conveyed her disagreement with the directive. "Can you handle the morning science activity? It's all prepared. Just follow the lesson plan on my desk." "Of course," Sarah replied confidently, though she noticed the conspicuous timing of the emergency meeting. As students settled into their seats, Sarah reviewed Ms. Chen's detailed notes. Today's lesson involved a simple demonstration of how different materials absorb water, a straightforward activity Sarah had conducted during her certification training. "Good morning, everyone," she greeted the class warmly. "Ms. Chen has been called to a meeting, so I'll be guiding our science activity today." A few students exchanged glances, but most responded with enthusiastic good mornings. "Can anyone tell me what we've been learning about in science this week?" Sarah asked, following Ms. Chen's established routine. Hands shot up eagerly. "Materials and their properties," answered Marcus. "Excellent. Today, we're going to observe how different materials absorb water." Sarah proceeded to explain the experiment while distributing the prepared trays of materials: paper towels, aluminum foil, wax paper, cotton balls, and small cups of colored water. The activity began smoothly, with students working in small groups to test each material and record their observations. Sarah circulated through the classroom, offering guidance and asking questions to deepen their understanding. "Miss Matthews, look," called Zoe, demonstrating how the paper towel had turned completely blue. "It absorbed all the water." "Great observation," Sarah praised. "And what happened with the aluminum foil?" "Nothing. The water just sits there," Zoe replied excitedly. Sarah beamed, the activity progressing exactly as planned. The children were engaged, learning, and following directions perfectly. For 20 beautiful minutes, she felt like any other educator, respected and effective. Then came the moment that would change everything. A student at the back table accidentally knocked over his cup of colored water while reaching for a cotton. The blue liquid cascaded across the table, dripping onto the floor before Sarah could intervene. "I'm sorry," the boy exclaimed, clearly distressed by his mistake. "It's okay, accidents happen," Sarah reassured him, quickly grabbing paper towels from the supply table. "Let's clean it up together." As Sarah helped the students contain the spill, another group called for her attention. Their water cup was also teetering precariously. In the momentary split of her attention, a third group decided to experiment by saturating multiple paper towels at once, creating another puddle on their table. The classroom, which had been running so smoothly just moments before, suddenly seemed to erupt with blue water incidents in every corner. Though none was serious, the cumulative effect created a chaotic scene of dripping tables and children, with blue-stained hands trying to help clean up. Sarah remained calm, directing students with clear instructions. Table 1, use your dry paper. Towels to blot, don't wipe. Table 3, please step back from the puddle. Marcus, can you bring the trash can closer? She had nearly restored order when the classroom door swung open to reveal Principal Hargrove, accompanied by 2 school board members who were conducting their annual school tour. The timing couldn't have been worse. Principal Hargrove surveyed the scene, blue water dripping from tables, students with stained hands, and Sarah in the center of it all, and her expression hardened into one of cold fury. "What is going on here?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the classroom. Before Sarah could explain, Principal Hargrove turned to the board members. "I apologize for this disruption. We're experiencing some staffing adjustments." Her pointed glance at Sarah made the implication clear. "Everything's under control," Sarah began. "There was a small accident during our absorption experiment." "Under control?" Principal Hargrove interrupted, her voice rising. "This classroom is in complete disarray. Where is Ms. Chen?" "She was called to an emergency meeting," Sarah explained, maintaining her composure despite the public confrontation. "The activity was going well until... This is exactly what happens when proper supervision protocols aren't followed," Principal Hargrove announced loudly, clearly performing for the board members rather than addressing Sarah directly. "This is why we have qualification standards." The student who had spilled the first cup stepped forward bravely. "It was my fault, Principal Hargrove. I knocked over the water by accident." Principal Hargrove barely acknowledged him, her focus fixed on making an example of Sarah. "Children, please line up quietly by the door. We'll find another classroom for you until Ms. Chen returns." As the confused students complied, Principal Hargrove turned to Sarah, speaking just loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This is completely unacceptable. I had reservations about this arrangement, and clearly my concerns were justified. Someone with your limitations simply cannot manage a classroom effectively." The cruel emphasis on limitations sent a wave of hushed shock through the students. Several looked at Sarah with confused concern, never having witnessed an adult being treated so dismissively. "I was managing the situation appropriately," Sarah responded, her voice steady despite the public humiliation burning through her. "Spills happen in science experiments with children. It's a normal part of the learning process. What you consider normal and what is acceptable in this school are clearly different matters," Principal Hargrove replied coldly. "You'll report to cafeteria duty for the remainder of the week. I'll be reviewing your placement immediately." As the principal ushered the students out, Sarah stood alone in the classroom, surrounded by half-cleaned blue puddles and the remnants of a lesson that had been going perfectly until moments ago. Unknown to both Sarah and Principal Hargrove, Meryl Streep had witnessed the entire exchange from the hallway, where she had been observing classrooms as part of her research. Her expression, initially curious, had transformed to one of quiet outrage as she watched the deliberate humiliation unfold. The faculty restroom was mercifully empty when Sarah finally allowed herself a moment of privacy. She leaned against the cool tile wall, eyes closed, breathing deliberately to contain the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. The familiar sting of public humiliation burned in her chest, but it was the crushing weight of injustice that made her hands tremble as she splashed cold water on her face. In the mirror, her reflection stared back, the same face that had smiled with such hope just yesterday morning, the same person whose certification hung proudly on her refrigerator, the same qualified professional who had been publicly degraded because of assumptions about her abilities. "Don't give them what they want," Sarah whispered to herself, repeating the mantra her mother had taught her years ago. "Don't let them make you believe what they believe about you." A text notification illuminated her phone screen. "Ms. Chen, are you okay? Just heard what happened. This is completely unfair." Before Sarah could respond, the restroom door opened. She quickly wiped her eyes, but not before a young teacher assistant named Megan glimpsed her distress. "I heard what happened," Megan said softly. "For what it's worth, most of us think it was handled terribly." "Most of you?" Sarah couldn't help asking. Megan hesitated. "Principal Hargrove has supporters, teachers who think the school should maintain certain standards." Her uncomfortable emphasis on standards revealed volumes about the underlying prejudice. In Ms. Chen's classroom, now empty of students, the blue water had been cleaned up. Ms. Chen herself paced anxiously, her expression lighting with concern. When Sarah entered, "This was deliberate," Ms. Chen said without preamble. "The emergency meeting was a budget discussion that could have happened any time. They wanted you alone when the board members toured." Sarah nodded, having suspected as much. "It doesn't matter. What matters is that I've been removed from classroom duties." "I've already spoken to Principal Hargrove," Ms. Chen replied, frustration evident in her voice. "She wouldn't budge. Claims it's for student safety, but we both know that's not true." Outside, in the hallway, voices drifted past the closed door. "Did you hear what happened in Ms. Chen's room? I'm not surprised. You can't expect someone like that to handle a classroom." "It's sad, but maybe this is for the best." Sarah closed her eyes briefly, the casual cruelty landing like physical blows. She had faced discrimination before, but something about this felt different, more calculated, more systematic in its determination to prove her incapable. Meanwhile, in the teacher's lounge, Meryl Streep, still anonymous in her modest disguise, sat quietly in the corner, ostensibly reviewing materials about the school's arts program, while actually listening intently to the conversations around her. "Hargrove was just waiting for something like this," whispered one teacher to another. "She never wanted to hire her in the first place. The district forced her hand. Something about diversity quotas," replied another. "But you have to admit, a classroom isn't the right place." "For what?" interrupted a third voice, Ms. Chen, who had entered in time to overhear. "For someone different than you?" "Because from what I observed, Sarah was handling that classroom better than some certified teachers I know." An uncomfortable silence fell over the lounge. Meryl Streep glanced up briefly, noting which teachers looked ashamed and which remained, defiantly prejudiced in their expressions. Back in the administration office, a video had begun circulating on staff phones. Someone had recorded the incident on their classroom observation tablet. What had been intended as evidence against Sarah was instead revealing the disproportionate reaction of Principal Hargrove. In the video, Sarah could clearly be seen managing the situation calmly until the principal's intervention created the true disruption. Parents began calling as students shared their version of events at home. "Zoe said the new teacher was being really nice, and then got in trouble for no reason," one mother reported to the front office. "What's going on over there?" By the end of the school day, the incident had evolved from a simple classroom management issue into something larger, a revealing moment that exposed the underlying attitudes of the school administration. Sarah spent the remainder of the afternoon processing her demotion paperwork in the Human Resources Office. The forms cited safety, concerns, and inadequate classroom management skills as official reasons for her reassignment to cafeteria duty. "This isn't accurate," Sarah stated firmly, pointing to the form. "The situation was under control until Principal Hargrove escalated it." The HR coordinator avoided eye contact. "I just processed the paperwork, Ms. Matthews. Appeals go through Principal Hargrove." "The same person who authorized this in the first place?" Sarah asked. the inherent injustice of the system becoming increasingly clear. As the school emptied for the day, Sarah gathered her teaching materials from Ms. Chen's classroom, unsure if she would ever use them again. Her careful lesson plan annotations and personalized student note cards, hours of preparation work, now seemed painfully optimistic. "This isn't over," Ms. Chen insisted, helping her pack. "The students are asking for you. Parents are calling." Even some of the staff who were on the fence are uncomfortable with how this was handled. Sarah appreciated the support, but recognized the reality of her situation. Principal Hargrove made her position clear. "I'm fighting not just her decision, but all the assumptions behind it." As she placed the last of her materials in her tote bag, Sarah's fingers brushed against her teaching assistant certification. She pulled it out, staring at the document that represented years of hard work and determination. "I didn't come this far to give up after one setback," she said finally, her voice finding new resolve. "If cafeteria duty is where they want me, then I'll make it the best cafeteria experience these children have ever had." Ms. Chen smiled, recognizing the resilience that had likely carried Sarah through countless previous obstacles. Unknown to either of them, Meryl Streep stood in the hallway just outside the classroom door, having lingered after most staff departed. Her expression was thoughtful as she made a phone call, speaking quietly but with clear purpose. "David? It's Meryl. I think we need to adjust our approach to this school visit. There's a situation here that needs addressing." She paused, listening to the response. "No, I'm not leaving. In fact, I think it's time to be a bit more visible. Tomorrow morning should be interesting." Sarah arrived at Westfield Elementary the next morning with a new strategy. If cafeteria duty was meant to diminish her, she would transform it into something meaningful instead. She had spent the evening researching creative approaches to cafeteria management, refusing to surrender to the demotion's intended message. The cafeteria, with its institutional beige walls, long tables, and perpetual scent of disinfectant and reheated food, was typically the most overlooked space in the school. Cafeteria monitors usually stood against walls, intervening only for discipline issues. It was supervision in its most basic form, exactly what Principal Hargrove thought appropriate for Sarah's limitations. Sarah arrived early, her tote bag filled with materials that puzzled the kitchen staff. "What are those for?" asked the head cook. Eyeing the colorful placemats and conversation starter cards Sarah began arranging. "Just a few additions to make lunchtime more engaging," Sarah replied cheerfully. "Is it okay if I put these out?" The cook shrugged. "No one's ever bothered before, but I don't see the harm." By the time the first lunch period began, Sarah had transformed her assigned tables with educational placemats, featuring world maps, multiplication tables, and fun facts about nutrition. Small jars held conversation prompt cards with questions, like, "If you could invent anything, what would it be?" and "What's the kindest thing someone did for you this week?" As Ms. Chen's class entered the cafeteria, the children's reactions were immediate and enthusiastic. "Ms. Matthews, you're here," Zoe exclaimed, running toward her. Other students followed, surrounding Sarah with excited greetings. "I'm helping in the cafeteria now," Sarah explained, maintaining her positive tone. "Because of the blue water?" asked Marcus, his expression troubled. "That wasn't your fault. I knocked over the first cup." Sarah knelt to his eye level. "Sometimes changes happen that we don't expect. The important thing is how we handle them." She gestured toward the tables. "Look what I've brought for lunchtime." The children eagerly explored the new elements, reading facts aloud and pulling conversation cards to share with table mates. What would typically have been 30 minutes of chaotic noise and rushed eating transformed into engaged conversations and genuine connections. From across the cafeteria, several teachers observed the scene with surprise. The usual lunchtime, behavior issues were noticeably reduced at Sarah's tables, where students were actively involved in the enrichment activities between bites of food. "What's happening over there?" asked a fifth-grade teacher, noticing the unusual engagement. Chen smiled knowingly. "That's Sarah Matthews making the best of a bad situation." By the second lunch period, word had spread. Students from other classes eagerly headed towards Sarah's section, drawn by the visible enthusiasm of their peers. Even older students, typically too self-conscious to show interest in structured activities, found themselves drawn into the geography games, and thought-provoking questions. Sarah moved through the cafeteria with natural ease, helping younger children open milk cartons, engaging shy students in gentle conversation, and mediating minor disputes with respectful guidance. Her approach wasn't just supervision, it was active engagement with the students' lunchtime experience. Near the cafeteria entrance, Meryl Streep observed the transformation. Today she had abandoned her scarf disguise, though her understated outfit and minimal makeup still allowed her to blend in more than her usual public appearances would permit. She watched Sarah intently, noting how the young woman had turned punishment into opportunity. A small commotion near the lunch line caught Sarah's attention. Her second grader had dropped his tray, sending chicken nuggets and applesauce scattering across the floor. The boy's face crumpled in embarrassment as nearby students began to point and laugh. Sarah reached him before the assigned cafeteria monitor could react. "Accidents happen," she said warmly, already helping him pick up the larger items. "Let's get this cleaned up and then we'll get you a new tray." Instead of simply calling the janitor, Sarah turned the moment into a brief lesson on community. "Who can help us?" she asked, and immediately several students volunteered, grabbing napkins and helping clean the spill. The boy's embarrassment transformed into relief as the potential humiliation became instead a moment of collective support. Within minutes he had a new lunch and was seated with friends, the incident already fading from importance. Principal Hargrove entered the cafeteria just as the cleanup finished, her expression souring as she observed the scene. The educational materials, the engaged students, the obvious success of Sarah's approach, all directly contradicted the narrative of incompetence she had constructed. "What is all this?" she demanded, gesturing toward the placemats and conversation jars. "Just some educational enrichment for lunchtime," Sarah replied calmly. The students seemed to enjoy it. Principal Hargrove's lips pressed into a thin line. "Cafeteria duty is about supervision, Ms. Matthews, not creating distractions. Please remove these materials immediately." Before Sarah could respond, a voice spoke from behind Principal Hargrove. "Actually, I find these materials fascinating. What a creative approach to an otherwise underutilized learning opportunity." Principal Hargrove turned, her dismissive expression freezing as she recognized Meryl Streep. For a moment, she seemed unable to process the presence of the Oscar-winning actress in her school cafeteria. Miss Streep," she finally managed, "I wasn't aware you were visiting today." "I've been observing classrooms all week," Meryl replied pleasantly, though her eyes held a pointed intensity. "Research for an upcoming role. I've found that administrative approaches here particularly educational." The emphasis on administrative approaches wasn't lost on Principal Hargrove, whose composure visibly faltered. "I'm especially impressed with this cafeteria program," Meryl continued, gesturing toward Sarah's tables. "In my visits to dozens of schools, I've never seen lunchtime utilized so effectively for continued learning. Whose initiative was this?" Before Principal Hargrove could respond, Sarah stepped forward and extended her hand. "Sarah Matthews, I'm new to the school this week." "Meryl Streep," the actress replied, shaking Sarah's hand warmly. "I'd love to hear more about your approach here." Principal Hargrove attempted to redirect the conversation. "Miss Streep, if you'd like a proper tour of our facility." "Actually," Meryl interrupted smoothly, "I'd prefer to continue observing Ms. Matthews' program. It's precisely the kind of innovative educational approach I'm researching." As Principal Hargrove retreated, with poorly disguised frustration, Meryl turned to Sarah with a knowing smile. "And now tell me how you developed this program so quickly. I suspect there's quite a story here." Word of Meryl Streep's presence spread through Westfield Elementary like wildfire. Teachers texted each other discreetly. Office staff found sudden reasons to visit the cafeteria, and even the maintenance crew managed to discover urgent tasks requiring their attention in the lunch area. Sarah, however, remained focused on her conversation with Meryl, explaining how she had transformed her cafeteria assignment into an educational opportunity. "I believe every moment with students is a chance to engage their minds," she said, unaware of the growing audience of staff members finding excuses to linger nearby. "That philosophy is exactly what drew me to this role," Meryl replied, her voice carrying just enough to be overheard by the hovering staff. "I'm playing a teacher who challenges a school system that underestimates the potential of students with different learning styles. Principal Hargrove, having composed herself after the initial shock, returned with the school superintendent, who had been hastily summoned from a district meeting. "Ms. Streep, what an unexpected honor," the superintendent gushed. "Had we known you were visiting, we would have prepared a proper welcome." "I preferred observing the authentic environment," Meryl replied with a polite but firm smile. "It's been most illuminating." The subtle emphasis on illuminating sent a flicker of unease across Principal Hargrove's face. The superintendent, oblivious to the tension, continued enthusiastically, "We'd be delighted to give you a tour of our award-winning programs. Perhaps we could move this conversation to a more appropriate venue than the cafeteria." "Actually," Meryl responded, "I find this venue perfectly appropriate. Ms. Matthews has created something quite remarkable here." She turned directly to the principal. "Though I understand this isn't her original position at the school," before Principal Hargrove could formulate a diplomatic response, the bell rang, signaling the end of the lunch period. Students reluctantly gathered their trays, many approaching Sarah to thank her for the activities before leaving. "Perhaps we could continue this discussion after I observe the afternoon assembly," Meryl suggested, her tone making it clear this was not merely a request. "I understand it's about community values. How fitting." The superintendent nodded eagerly. "Of course, we'd be honored to have you attend. Principal Hargrove has prepared an excellent presentation on our school's commitment to inclusion and respect." As the cafeteria emptied, Sarah began collecting her materials, uncertain of her role in the unfolding situation. Meryl approached her with a quiet intensity. "Will you be attending the assembly?" she asked Sarah. "I wasn't planning to," Sarah admitted. "Staff in disciplinary review aren't typically included in school events." Meryl's eyebrows rose slightly. "Disciplinary review? For what offense?" Sarah hesitated, uncomfortable with appearing to complain. "There was an incident during a science lesson. The official reason is inadequate classroom management." "I see," Meryl replied, her expression revealing she understood far more than those simple words conveyed. "Well, I think your presence at an assembly about community values would be especially appropriate. Would you accompany me?" The invitation, delivered within earshot of Principal Hargrove and the superintendent, left no room for objection. Sarah found herself escorted to the gymnasium, alongside one of the world's most celebrated actresses, while behind them, administrators exchanged panicked whispers. The gymnasium buzzed with excitement as students settled onto the bleachers. Teachers attempted to maintain order while stealing glances at Meryl Streep, who sat alongside Sarah, in chairs hastily arranged at the side of the staging area. Principal Hargrove approached the microphone, her professional smile firmly in place despite the visible tension in her shoulders. "Good afternoon, Westfield Elementary. Today we have a special guest joining us for our Community Values Assembly. We're honored to welcome acclaimed actress Meryl Streep, who is researching an upcoming role." Enthusiastic applause erupted, with several older students gasping as they recognized the celebrity in their midst. Meryl acknowledged them with a gracious wave. "Our school has always prioritized creating an inclusive environment where everyone is treated with dignity and respect," Principal Hargrove continued, launching into her prepared speech. "At Westfield, we believe that our differences make us stronger, and we strive to ensure every member of our community feels valued." As the principal continued extolling the school's commitment to inclusion and respect, Meryl's expression grew increasingly contemplative. She leaned towards Sarah, whispering, "Interesting choice of words given what I've observed." Principal Hargrove's speech reached its conclusion, and so I challenge each of you to consider how your actions reflect our core values of empathy, understanding, and acceptance. Are there questions before we dismiss? The principal clearly expected the formulaic assembly to conclude without disruption. Instead, Meryl Streep rose from her seat, the movement immediately drawing all eyes in the gymnasium. "I actually do have a question," Meryl stated, her voice carrying effortlessly through the space without need of the microphone. "You've spoken eloquently about inclusion and respect. How do those values apply to your staff members, particularly those who might be perceived as different?" A hushed silence fell over the gymnasium. Principal Hargrove's smile remained fixed, though her knuckles whitened around the edges of the podium. All our hiring and personnel decisions reflect our commitment to diversity, Mrs. Streep. Indeed. Meryl approached the center of the gymnasium floor, her presence commanding the space with the skill of decades on stage and screen. Then perhaps you could explain why I witnessed a qualified teaching assistant being publicly humiliated for handling a minor classroom incident, an incident any teacher would have faced with a science experiment involving water and third graders. The silence in the gymnasium deepened. Students exchanged wide-eyed glances, while teachers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I'm not sure which incident you're referring to, Principal Hargrove attempted, though her voice had lost its confident edge. I think you know exactly which incident I mean, Meryl replied, her voice simultaneously gentle and unyielding. Yesterday, I watched Miss Matthews calmly managing a typical classroom situation until you arrived, and used it as an opportunity to remove her from the classroom, all while making pointed references to her limitations. Principal Hargrove's face paled visibly. There seems to be a misunderstanding about an internal personnel matter. Is it a misunderstanding that Miss Matthews has been relegated to cafeteria duty despite her qualifications? Meryl continued, turning to address the assembled students and staff directly. Is it a misunderstanding that different standards are being applied based on appearance rather than ability? The superintendent stepped forward, attempting to diffuse the situation. Ms. Streep, we appreciate your concern, but perhaps this discussion would be better continued in private. No, Meryl interrupted firmly. This conversation began publicly when Ms. Matthews was humiliated in front of her students. The remedy should be equally public. She turned back to face the entire assembly. I came here researching a role about inclusive education. What I've witnessed instead is the very discrimination my film aims to challenge. A stunned silence hung over the gymnasium. Students sat motionless on the bleachers, teachers exchanged anxious glances, and Principal Hargrove stood frozen at the podium, her practiced composure crumbling under Meryl Streep's unflinching gaze. The superintendent stepped forward, his voice overly cheerful in an attempt to diffuse the tension. Perhaps we should conclude the assembly and continue this discussion in the conference room. No, Meryl interrupted firmly. The students deserve to witness this conversation. They've already seen the discrimination. They should also see the accountability. She turned to address the students directly. How many of you were in Miss Chen's class yesterday during the science experiment? A dozen hands rose hesitantly. And what did you observe before Principal Hargrove arrived? Marcus, the boy who had spilled the first cup of water, stood up. Ms. Matthews was helping us clean up the spills. She wasn't mad or anything. She said accidents happen during experiments. It wasn't even that big a mess, added Zoe. We were learning about absorption. Ms. Matthews said scientists always have to clean up after experiments. Other students nodded in agreement, their confidence growing as they realized the famous actress was actually listening to them. Principal Hargrove attempted to regain control. Children often don't understand the safety implications of classroom management issues. I understand safety, interjected a third grader. My mum's a nurse. There wasn't anything dangerous, it was just blue water. The superintendent, sensing the situation spiraling beyond damage control, gestured toward the teachers. Let's dismiss the students and... Why? Meryl challenged. Because they're speaking truth that contradicts the official narrative. These children are demonstrating more integrity than some of the adults in this room. She turned toward Sarah, who had remained seated, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of disbelief and vindication. Ms. Matthews, would you join me? Sarah rose and walked to stand beside Meryl, her steps steady despite the hundreds of eyes following her movement. This educator was removed from her classroom, not because of incompetence, but because of how she looks, Meryl stated, her voice carrying to every corner of the gymnasium. I've spent the week observing this school because I'm researching a role about inclusive education. I chose Westfield specifically because of its public commitment to diversity and inclusion, values that your principal just eloquently described. Principal Hargrove's face flushed. Ms. Streep, with all due respect, you observed a brief moment. Without understanding the context, I observed for 3 days, Meryl corrected her. I saw Ms. Matthews being excluded from communications, denied resources, and set up for failure. I watched her overcome each obstacle with professionalism and grace. And yesterday I witnessed her humiliation over a minor incident that any teacher might have faced. The superintendent, realizing the potential public relations disaster unfolding, tried a different approach. We take these concerns very seriously. If there have been any misunderstandings about Ms. Matthews' capabilities, this isn't a misunderstanding, Meryl interrupted. It's discrimination, carefully disguised as concern for standards and protocols. She addressed the entire assembly again. I came here to understand how schools truly implement inclusive education. What I found instead was a powerful lesson in how institutions can preach inclusion while practicing exclusion. How easy it is to hide discrimination behind policies and procedures that seem neutral on the surface. Principal Hargrove, desperate to end the public exposure, made one final attempt. If there have been any inappropriate actions, we will certainly review them through proper channels. The time for private reviews is past, Meryl stated firmly. Now is the time for public accountability. She turned to Sarah. Ms. Matthews, in the days I've observed you, I've seen extraordinary teaching skills, creative problem-solving, and remarkable patience, qualities any school should value. Would you be willing to share your perspective on what happened? Sarah took a deep breath, acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes upon her. When she spoke, her voice was clear and steady. I became a teaching assistant because I believe everyone deserves an education that respects their unique abilities. I worked twice as hard for my certification because I knew I would face doubts about my capabilities. She paused, gathering her thoughts. When I arrived at Westfield, I expected challenges. I faced them my whole life. What I didn't expect was to be systematically undermined from the moment I walked through the door. I was excluded from communications, denied resources other teaching assistants received, and eventually set up to fail when Ms. Chen was called to an unnecessary meeting. Principal Hargrove shook her head in denial, but Sarah continued undeterred. Yesterday's incident was a normal part of experiential learning. Any science teacher knows spills happen. I was managing the situation appropriately when Principal Hargrove arrived with the school board members. Timing that seems less coincidental the more I reflect on it. The superintendent, finally recognizing the gravity of the situation, turned to Principal Hargrove with a questioning look. Diana, is there truth to this? Principal Hargrove's professional veneer cracked under the combined pressure of public scrutiny and her superior's direct question. The district's diversity initiatives forced my hand in hiring decisions. I was trying to protect the educational standards of this school. A collective gasp echoed through the gymnasium at this tacit admission. Protect standards, Meryl questioned, or protect prejudice? Because what I observed was a qualified educator being held to standards no other staff member would face. The superintendent, now visibly troubled, addressed Sarah directly. Ms. Matthews, I was unaware of these circumstances. This is not how our district operates, and there will be a full investigation. Investigation is a start, Meryl acknowledged, but it's not enough. What about immediate remedies? Ms. Matthews deserves restoration of her proper role and a public apology at minimum. Principal Hargrove stiffened. A public apology would undermine my authority. Your actions have already done that, Meryl replied calmly. Integrity is not preserved by hiding mistakes, but by acknowledging and correcting them. The superintendent nodded in agreement. Principal Hargrove, I believe Ms. Streep is right. This situation requires immediate remediation. For a moment, Principal Hargrove seemed ready to continue resisting. Then, confronted by the unwavering gazes of Meryl Streep, the superintendent, and hundreds of students witnessing this lesson in accountability, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Ms. Matthews, she began reluctantly, I acknowledge that your treatment has been inappropriate. You will be restored to your classroom assistant position, effective immediately. The apology was minimal and clearly reluctant, but it was a start. Sarah nodded her acceptance, maintaining her dignity and victory as she had in adversity. This is just the beginning of making things right, Meryl stated, making it clear the conversation was far from over. Now, I believe we all have much to discuss about what genuine inclusion looks like in practice, not just in speeches. The morning after the assembly confrontation, Sarah arrived at Westfield Elementary to find the atmosphere noticeably transformed. Teachers who had previously avoided eye contact now offered tentative smiles. Administrative staff who had forgotten to include her in communications suddenly appeared eager to ensure she received every memo and update. But the most significant change awaited her in Ms. Chen's classroom, where Meryl Streep sat casually reviewing lesson plans as though her presence, a 3-time Academy Award winner in a 3rd-grade classroom, were perfectly ordinary. "Good morning," Meryl greeted her warmly. "I hope you don't mind, but I've arranged to shadow you today. My research for this role feels incomplete without seeing you work in your proper environment." Sarah, still processing the surreal turn of events, nodded her agreement. "I'd be honored, though I should warn you that 3rd-graders aren't easily impressed by celebrity. They're more likely to ask if you know their favorite Disney character than about your Oscar wins." Meryl laughed, a genuine sound that immediately lightened the atmosphere. "That's precisely why I enjoy working with children. Their priorities are refreshingly uncomplicated." Ms. Chen entered, carrying an armful of science materials. "Sarah and Ms. Streep, I wasn't sure if yesterday's plans had changed." "Not at all," Meryl replied. "I'm here strictly as an observer. Please proceed as if I weren't here." That, of course, proved impossible as soon as the students arrived. The presence of Meryl Streep created an initial flutter of excitement, with several children recognizing her from various films. However, true to Sarah's prediction, their questions focused primarily on whether she knew various cartoon characters or could sing songs from animated movies. Meryl handled their curiosity with grace, answering a few questions before gently redirecting their attention to the day's lessons. "I'm here to learn from Ms. Matthews today, just like you are." As the morning progressed, Sarah led a reading group, while Ms. Chen worked with another section of the class. Sarah's natural teaching abilities shone as she engaged struggling readers with patience and encouragement, differentiating her approach for each child's needs. Meryl observed intently, occasionally making notes, but mostly watching the subtle techniques Sarah employed, the way she positioned herself at eye level with the children, her use of specific praise rather than generic compliments, her skillful redirection of wandering attention. During a quick break while students worked, independently, Meryl leaned over to Sarah. "You have extraordinary intuition with them. That moment with Tyler, when you sensed his frustration before he even expressed it, that's something many trained actors struggle to achieve." Sarah smiled, surprised by the specific observation. "I think sometimes being underestimated, your whole life makes you more attuned to others' emotions. You develop a kind of radar for subtle cues." The morning's unexpected highlight came during the rescheduled science experiment, the same water absorption activity that had previously ended in disaster. This time, with both Sarah and Ms. Chen supervising and Meryl assisting by distributing materials, the lesson proceeded smoothly, despite the inevitable small spills. "Notice how we contain the water using these trays," Sarah explained to the class. "Scientists always prepare for variables like accidental spills because they're part of the experimental process." When a cup of blue water tipped over, Sarah demonstrated proper cleanup while continuing the lesson. "Absorption in action," she commented, using the paper towels to soak up the spill. "What excellent real-world application of our experiment." The students giggled, and the moment that had previously been used to humiliate Sarah became instead a seamless teaching opportunity. During lunch, Meryl joined Sarah in the cafeteria, where they were approached by a steady stream of staff members, many offering belated welcomes or awkward apologies disguised as small talk. "Remarkable how perspectives can shift overnight," Meryl observed quietly. "The presence of an Academy Award winner tends to have that effect," Sarah replied with gentle humor. "No," Meryl corrected her. "My presence merely provided a mirror. The reflection has always been there. Some just chose not to see it." In the afternoon, Sarah introduced a creative learning activity she had designed herself, a multisensory approach to understanding fractions using music, movement, and visual aids. The students, divided into groups representing different fraction values, created rhythmic patterns that demonstrated mathematical relationships. Meryl, initially seated at the back of the classroom, found herself drawn into participation, joining the 1/4 group in their pattern demonstration. The sight of Meryl Streep clapping out fraction rhythms alongside giggling third graders quickly drew attention from passing staff, who paused at the classroom door to witness the unexpected scene. Principal Hargrove, making her first appearance since the previous day's confrontation, stood rigidly in the doorway, clearly uncertain of her role in this transformed dynamic. Her usual authoritative presence seemed diminished as she watched, the acclaimed actress participating enthusiastically in Sarah's innovative lesson. When the activity concluded, Principal Hargrove approached with a folder of documents. "Ms. Matthews, these are the correct employment forms to replace the inappropriate ones you were given earlier." Her voice was professional, but lacked its former condescension. "And the staff meeting agenda for tomorrow includes your introduction, i.e. proper one this time." "Thank you," Sarah replied simply, accepting both the folder and the unspoken acknowledgement it represented. As Principal Hargrove turned to leave, Meryl called after her, "Principal Hargrove, I'd like to discuss implementing some of Ms. Matthews's educational approaches more broadly across the school. Her fraction activity in particular has remarkable potential for students with diverse learning styles." The request, framed as a foregone conclusion rather than a suggestion, left the principal little room to object. "Of course. Perhaps we could schedule a meeting to discuss possibilities." "Excellent," Meryl replied. "With Sarah's participation naturally, her insights will be essential to successful implementation." After Principal Hargrove departed, Ms. Chen couldn't suppress her smile. "I've never seen her so accommodating." "Accountability often has that effect," Meryl observed, "but true change requires more than a single moment of reckoning. It needs sustained commitment to different practices." As the school day neared its end, Sarah led the students in a reflection activity, asking them to share one new thing they had learned. The responses ranged from scientific observations about absorption to mathematical insights about fractions, but the most poignant came from Zoe. "I learned that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes too, and the brave ones admit it and fix them." Sarah exchanged a meaningful glance with Meryl, both recognizing the profound wisdom in the child's simple observation. When the final bell rang, Sarah found herself surrounded by colleagues who had previously avoided her, now eager to learn more about her multi-sensory teaching techniques and creative cafeteria activities. "This isn't just about me anymore, is it?" Sarah asked Meryl quietly as they gathered their belongings. "It never was," Meryl replied. "Your situation simply made visible what was already present, but unacknowledged. The question now is whether this awareness creates lasting change or fades once the spotlight moves elsewhere." Sarah considered this as she looked around the classroom, her classroom, at least for now. "Then I suppose we'll need to keep the light shining," Meryl smiled approvingly. "That, Miss Matthews, is exactly what I intended all along." 1 month later, Westfield Elementary's auditorium buzzed with anticipation. Colorful banners proclaiming Inclusion Awareness Day hung from the walls, and the stage was set with chairs for panel speakers. In the front row, Sarah Matthews sat reviewing her notes, the butterfly pin on her blouse catching the light as she made final adjustments to her speech. The past month had brought remarkable changes. Following Meryl Streep's intervention, the district had launched a comprehensive review of inclusion practices across all schools. Principal Hargrove, after initial resistance, had undergone a surprising transformation, part genuine growth, part career preservation, becoming a vocal advocate for the very inclusion initiatives she had previously undermined. More significantly, Sarah had been fully reinstated as a teaching assistant and asked to lead the development of a new multisensory learning program based on her innovative approaches. The fraction activity that Meryl had participated in was now being implemented in mathematics classes throughout the district. "Nervous?" asked Ms. Chen, sliding into the seat beside Sarah. "A little," Sarah admitted. "Public speaking is different than teaching children." "You'll be wonderful," Ms. Chen assured her. "Just speak from experience, like you've been doing in our teacher training sessions." Those training sessions, another new development, had initially been met with skepticism from some staff members, but Sarah's practical demonstrations and undeniable results with students had gradually won over even the most resistant teachers. Her ability to translate complex educational theory into accessible techniques had proven invaluable. As the auditorium filled with parents, educators from across the district, and community members, Sarah spotted Jake Peterson, the administrative assistant who had given her the inappropriate guardianship forms on her first day. He approached hesitantly. "Ms. Matthews, I wanted to apologize properly," he said, his previous indifference replaced with genuine remorse. "I knew those forms weren't right, but I didn't speak up. I was just following the expected pattern." "Patterns can be broken," Sarah replied with a gentle smile. "That's what today is all about." The lights dimmed, signaling the start of the program. Superintendent Crawford took the stage, welcoming everyone to Westfield's first Inclusion Awareness Day. "This event marks not just a celebration, but a commitment to ongoing growth," he explained. "A commitment inspired by extraordinary circumstances that revealed both our failures and our potential." He introduced Principal Hargrove, whose entrance was met with polite applause. She approached the microphone with an uncharacteristic humility. "A month ago, I stood in our gymnasium and spoke about values I claim to uphold," she began. "Values of respect, inclusion, and dignity for all. But my actions, our actions as an institution, were not aligned with those words." She paused, visibly working through her discomfort with public accountability. "It took someone extraordinary to hold up a mirror and force us to see that disconnect. Actually, two extraordinary women." She gestured towards Sarah. "Ms. Matthews joined our staff with impeccable qualifications and a genuine gift for reaching students. Instead of recognizing that gift, I allowed preconceptions about her disability to cloud my judgment." The honesty of this admission sent a ripple of murmurs through the audience. Many had heard rumors about the incident, but few expected such direct acknowledgement. "The changes we've implemented over the past month aren't about avoiding embarrassment or satisfying district mandates," Principal Hargrove continued. "They're about becoming the school we always claimed to be, one where diversity is truly valued, not merely tolerated." She introduced Sarah, who approached the podium amid enthusiastic applause, particularly from the section where Ms. Chen's class sat with handmade Ms. Matthews fan club signs. "Thank you, Principal Hargrove," Sarah began, her voice clear and steady. "My journey at Westfield began with challenges I've faced throughout my life, assumptions about what I could or couldn't do based solely on how I look." She shared her experiences candidly, from the exclusion she'd felt to the transformation she'd witnessed. "The question isn't whether people with differences can succeed. We've been proving that possible throughout history. The question is whether systems and institutions will recognize capability wherever it exists." Sarah described the innovative programs she'd helped develop, emphasizing how approaches originally designed for students with different learning styles often benefited all students. Inclusion isn't about special accommodations for a few, it's about creating environments where everyone can thrive. As she concluded her speech, the auditorium erupted in applause. The superintendent returned to the microphone, announcing the establishment of the Matthews Inclusion Initiative, a district-wide program to recruit and support educators from diverse backgrounds, particularly those with disabilities. "And we have one more announcement," he added, gesturing toward the side entrance of the auditorium. Meryl Streep walked in, immediately drawing gasps of recognition from the audience. She had returned, as promised, to see the lasting impact of her intervention. "When I visited Westfield a month ago," Meryl began once the excitement settled, "I was researching a role about challenging educational barriers. What I witnessed instead was a real-life demonstration of both those barriers and the courage required to dismantle them." She announced that her production company would establish a scholarship fund for students with disabilities pursuing careers in education. The Sarah Matthews Scholarship will ensure that more classrooms benefit from the unique perspectives that come from navigating a world not designed for you. Sarah, overwhelmed by this unexpected honor, wiped away tears as she rejoined Meryl at the podium for a shared embrace that drew emotional applause from the audience. After the formal program concluded, Sarah found herself surrounded by parents, teachers from other schools, and community members eager to learn more about the inclusion initiatives. In this circle of engaged conversation, she caught sight of Zoe approaching with something clutched carefully in her hands. "Miss Matthews, we made this for you," Zoe announced, presenting a framed photograph of Sarah working with students, decorated with colorful thumbprints from every child in the class. Beneath the photo, they had written, "Different isn't less, it's just different." Later that afternoon, as the auditorium emptied, Principal Hargrove supervised the hanging of a new display in the school's main entrance. It featured a photograph of Sarah and Meryl together, alongside a plaque reading, "Diversity isn't just about who we include, but whose contributions we value." As Sarah prepared to leave, Meryl walked her to her car. "The film is moving forward," she mentioned, "but I've revised the character considerably, inspired by what I witnessed here." "Will it have a happy ending?" Sarah asked. Meryl smiled thoughtfully. "Not an ending, a beginning. Just like this isn't the end of your story, but the beginning of its wider impact." Sarah looked back at the school, a place that had nearly broken her dream, but had instead become the launching point for something far greater than she had imagined. From classroom humiliation to district-wide transformation, she reflected. "I never expected my teaching journey to take this path." "The most important lessons," Meryl replied, "are often the ones we never planned to teach." As Sarah drove away, the afternoon sun illuminated her butterfly pin, a simple symbol of transformation that now seemed more fitting than ever before. If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will warm your heart. Click the screen to explore more stories of hope, compassion, and resilience.